They say a man's home is his castle, but in Lake Serenity Estates, the HOA acts like they're the monarchy, and I was just the latest peasant to be taxed for an imaginary crime. That $50,000 fine they slapped on me for my new driveway wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the corruption that festers when small-minded people get a taste of authority. If you've ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA, you'll want to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Share your own HOA horror stories in the comments. We read every single one, and sometimes even feature them in future videos. My name is Bob Henderson. I'm 62 years old, a retired civil engineer, and I've lived in my home at Lake Serenity Estates for over 20 years. When my wife Martha and I first moved here in 2002, it was paradise. The HOA was reasonable, focused on maintaining property values without being overbearing. We knew everyone on our street, had block parties, and took pride in our community. But things change, people move, new residents arrive with different ideas, and somehow the most power-hungry, controlling personalities always seem to wind up on the HOA board. The trouble started last spring. My original driveway, installed when the house was built, had deteriorated badly. Cracks ran through it like a spider web, and the slope to my garage had become a safety hazard, especially when it rained. At 62, I didn't need another broken hip from slipping on my own property. I did what any responsible homeowner would do. I researched solutions. Being a retired engineer, I was thorough. I discovered permeable pavers that would not only solve the drainage issue, but were environmentally friendly, allowing rainwater to filter naturally back into the ground instead of running off into the storm system. The contractor I hired was top-notch, licensed and insured. Before work began, I casually mentioned to my neighbor Jim that I was finally replacing that eyesore of a driveway. "You might want to check with the HOA, Bob," Jim said, lowering his voice. "Margaret Wilson's been on a tear lately about unapproved improvements." Margaret Wilson, the HOA president who'd moved in just 3 years ago and immediately started making changes. She was the one who sent violation notices for trash cans being visible 15 minutes past pickup time and measured grass height with a ruler. "I'll submit the plans," I told Jim, though I was annoyed. "It's just a driveway, for crying out loud." I filled out the HOA's improvement request form, attached the contractor's information and material specifications, and dropped it off at the management office. 2 weeks passed with no response. Another week went by. I called and was told they were backlogged. Meanwhile, spring was turning into summer, and my driveway was getting worse. Martha had already slipped once, though thankfully she caught herself before falling. I called the HOA office again. "Look, I submitted this request 3 weeks ago," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "The safety issue is getting worse." The young woman on the other end sighed. "Mr. Henderson, the board meets monthly. Your request will be reviewed at the next meeting." "When's that?" "In 2 weeks." I hung up frustrated. The contractor had a window of availability, and if I didn't take it, I'd have to wait another 2 months. I made a decision. I'd proceed with the work and submit the approval retroactively. After all, this was clearly an improvement, not some wild deviation from community standards. The work took 3 days. The new driveway looked fantastic, better than the original, in fact. The permeable pavers were a subtle grey that complemented our home's exterior, and the improved grading eliminated the water pooling issue that had been eroding my lawn for years. Martha and I were sitting on the front porch, admiring the work when Margaret Wilson herself marched up our walkway. I recognized her immediately from the community meetings. perfectly coiffed hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and a permanent expression of disapproval. "Mr. Henderson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I see you've installed new driveway pavers without approval." "I submitted the request 3 weeks ago, Margaret," I replied calmly. "No one responded, and this was becoming a safety issue." "The board has not approved this," she said, her voice tight. "The covenants are specific about driveway materials. This isn't on the approved list. It's a superior product to what was here before," I said, standing up. "It's safer, better for the environment, and looks more attractive than the cracked concrete that was deteriorating." "That's not for you to determine," she snapped. "The board will address this at our next meeting." She turned and marched away without another word. Martha squeezed my hand. "Trouble." "Nothing that can't be resolved," I said, though I felt a knot of tension forming in my stomach. You wouldn't believe what they did next. At the HOA meeting the following week, I presented my case, showing photos of the deteriorated driveway, explaining the safety concerns, and providing documentation about the environmental benefits of the new materials. Several board members seemed sympathetic, but Margaret Wilson controlled that board with an iron fist. "The covenants are clear," she stated flatly. "Driveways must be poured concrete or asphalt. These pavers are in violation." "Surely there's room for interpretation," I said. "This is an improvement in every conceivable way." "The violation stands," she declared. "You have 30 days to remove the pavers and install an approved material. If you fail to comply, fines will accrue at $100 per day." I was stunned. "You can't be serious. That would cost me another $15,000 on top of what I've already spent." "Then you should have waited for approval," she said coldly. "Next item." I sat there in disbelief as they moved on to discuss someone's unauthorized flower pots. The injustice of it burned in my chest. If this HOA sounds unbelievable already, make sure to hit subscribe. You don't want to miss how this ends. The next few weeks were hell. Every morning there would be a violation notice on my door. Every afternoon, Margaret or one of her cronies would drive slowly past my house taking photos. The fines were mounting, $100 per day, just as she'd threatened. I consulted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He reviewed my case and shook his head. "Technically, they're within their rights," he said. "The covenants are specific, and you did proceed without approval, but $100 a day is excessive. We could fight that in court." Court! The word hung in the air. I'm not a litigious man, but this was war. I authorized him to send a letter challenging the daily fines as punitive and unreasonable. Meanwhile, I reached out to neighbors. Jim, who'd warned me about Margaret, told me his own story. They fined me $500 because my lawn was a quarter-inch. "Too high according to their measurements," he said, shaking his head. "I paid it rather than fight, but I regret it now." Another neighbor, Sarah, a widow in her 70s, had been fined for having her grandchildren's toys visible in the backyard during non-visitation hours. "The list goes on," she told me. "Margaret and her friends on the board are running this place like their personal fiefdom." As we talked, an idea began to form. What if this wasn't just about my driveway? What if we could challenge the entire regime? Then came the false hope. After my lawyer sent the letter, the HOA's attorney responded with an offer to reduce the fines to $5,000 total if I would come into compliance by removing the pavers within 60 days. It was still outrageous, but it was something. I met with Martha at the kitchen table, spreadsheets open, calculating costs. If we fight this in court, it could take years and cost tens of thousands, she said practically. Maybe we should just pay the reduced fine and be done with it. I hated the idea of giving in, but she had a point. The stress was affecting both of us. I called my lawyer and told him to accept their offer. "Are you sure, Bob?" he asked. "This sets a precedent that they can bully homeowners into compliance." "I'm sure," I said, exhausted. "Let's just end this." We drafted a response agreeing to their terms. I was preparing to sign it when Jim called me. "Don't do it, Bob," he said urgently. "Sarah and I were talking to some other neighbors, and we found something you need to see." "What is it?" "Come to the community center in an hour. Bring copies of all your HOA documents." Curious, I gathered the papers and drove to the community center. To my surprise, about 15 neighbors were there, including Sarah and Jim. "We've been doing some research," Sarah explained. "Remember how Margaret pushed through those covenant amendments last year?" I nodded vaguely. There had been a vote, but like most residents, I hadn't paid close attention. "Turns out there were some irregularities in how that was handled," Jim said, spreading documents across the table. "For one thing, they never achieved the quorum required for a vote. But more importantly," Sarah continued, "look at this." She pointed to a clause in the original covenants from when the community was established in 1998. It was buried in the section about environmental improvements. "Any improvement that demonstrably enhances environmental sustainability or addresses safety hazards may be approved by the Architectural Committee without full board review, provided such improvements do not adversely affect neighboring properties." I read it twice. My driveway qualifies on both counts: environmental sustainability and safety hazard. "Exactly," Jim said. "And here's the kicker. Margaret's amendments tried to eliminate this clause, but because they didn't achieve a proper quorum, those amendments aren't legally valid." I felt a surge of hope. "So the original clause still stands?" "It appears so," said a voice from the back of the room. It was Tom, a retired attorney who lived down the street. "I've reviewed all the documents, and I believe we have a strong case that not only is your driveway not in violation, but the fines they've levied are improper." The room buzzed with excitement, but Tom held up his hand. "There's more," he said gravely. "In the process of investigating this, we've uncovered some irregularities in the HOA's finances." He spread out financial records across the table. "It appears that Margaret and several board members have been using HOA funds for personal expenses, lavish dinners, trips, even home improvements, all charged to the association." I looked at the documents, my blood running cold. "How much?" "Best we can tell, upwards of $200,000 over the past 3 years, Tom replied. The room fell silent. This was bigger than any of us had imagined. Can you believe they actually did this? Subscribe now so you'll never miss another crazy HOA story. We decided to act. Tom agreed to represent us pro bono, filing a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board and a lawsuit against the HOA and its board members personally. 23 homeowners signed on as plaintiffs. The response was swift and vicious. Margaret Wilson appeared at my door with the sheriff herself, a woman I'd known casually for years, who looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Henderson," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we have a new violation notice for you." The sheriff handed me an official-looking document. My heart sank as I read it. The HOA was now fining me $50,000 for willful and repeated violations of the covenants, plus threatening to place a lien on my home if I didn't pay within 30 days. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You know we're challenging your authority. The HOA has every right to enforce its covenants," Margaret replied smugly. "Pay the fine, remove the driveway, and this all goes away." I looked at the sheriff, who met my gaze with a sympathetic shrug. "I'm just serving the papers, Bob. You know how this works." After they left, I called Tom. "They've escalated this to a whole new level," I told him. $50,000. "Actually, this helps our case," he said calmly. "This clearly demonstrates punitive intent and abuse of power. We'll amend our complaint to include this." The next few weeks were a blur of legal maneuvers. The HOA tried to have our case dismissed, but Tom was prepared. He presented evidence of the improper covenant amendments, the financial mismanagement, and now this outrageous fine. The judge denied their dismissal motion and set a date for a preliminary hearing. Margaret and her board were growing desperate. One evening, as Martha and I were watching TV, there was a loud banging on our door. I opened it to find Margaret, red-faced and furious. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she spat. "Ganging up with your neighbors to destroy this community. This community was fine before you and your friends decided to turn it into your personal piggy bank," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "We're just taking back what's rightfully ours." "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she threatened. "I have friends in high places. This will not end well for you." "Threats now, Margaret?" I asked. "That's a new low, even for you." She stormed off, and I called Tom to report the incident. "We'll add that to the complaint," he said. "Intimidation. Tactics won't play well in court." The preliminary hearing was a turning point. Tom presented our evidence methodically: the improper covenant amendments, the original clause that exempted my driveway, the financial records showing mismanagement, and the escalating fines and threats. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that these were internal HOA matters, but the judge wasn't having it. "When an HOA abuses its power to the extent alleged here," she said, "it becomes a matter for the courts. I'm allowing this case to proceed." Margaret's face was a mask of fury as she left the courtroom. She pushed past me without a word. The discovery process that followed was illuminating. We obtained emails between board members discussing how to punish homeowners they didn't like, receipts for personal expenses charged to the HOA, and even communications with contractors who received preferential treatment in exchange for kickbacks. The most damning evidence came from a former board member who had resigned in protest. She provided testimony about Margaret's methods of intimidation and her systematic misuse of HOA funds. As the trial date approached, the pressure mounted. The HOA sent out notices of a special assessment to cover legal expenses, $2,000 per household. This backfired spectacularly as it united even more residents against the board. The trial lasted 5 days. Tom presented our case flawlessly, calling multiple witnesses and presenting documentary evidence of the HOA's misconduct. I testified about my driveway, the safety concerns, and the escalating harassment. Margaret took the stand in her own defense, but under cross-examination, her story fell apart. She became flustered and angry, eventually blurting out that homeowners like me needed to be taught a lesson about following rules. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. They found in our favor on all counts, awarding me $50,000 in damages to cover the fine they had imposed, ordering the HOA to cover all legal costs, and most significantly, recommending criminal charges against Margaret and 2 other board members for financial mismanagement. But the poetic justice didn't end there. The judge went further, removing the entire HOA board and appointing a temporary receiver to oversee new elections. She also invalidated all the covenant amendments passed under Margaret's tenure, restoring the original documents that included the environmental and safety exemption I had relied on. The final irony. Margaret Wilson was forced to personally pay restitution to the HOA for the funds she had misappropriated. The sale of her luxury car and some jewelry barely covered a fraction of what she owed. She was forced to downsize dramatically, moving from her prestigious home in Lake Serenity Estates to a modest apartment across town. As for me, my driveway remains exactly as I installed it, a safe, environmentally responsible improvement that enhances both my property and the community. The new HOA board, elected by residents who had learned the dangers of apathy, even used it as an example of appropriate sustainable improvements in their updated guidelines. Martha and I sit on our front porch sometimes, watching our neighbors come and go. The atmosphere in the community has changed. People are friendlier, more engaged. We have block parties again, just like when we first moved in. The lesson in all this? Power corrupts, but only when good people do nothing. HOAs can be valuable for maintaining community standards, but when they overreach, when they become tools for petty tyrants, it's up to residents to stand together and say, enough. If you're dealing with an HOA that seems to have forgotten who they work for, remember my story. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to stand up for what's fair. And if you've got your own HOA horror story, share it in the comments below. We read every single one, and sometimes just knowing you're not alone makes all the difference. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about standing up to injustice, one driveway at a time. Until next time, I'm Bob Henderson, reminding you that sometimes the biggest battles are fought right in your own front yard.